1939. Shells struck a remote Finnish border village. According to the Soviet Union, on November 26, 1939, 4 border guards were killed when Finnish artillery allegedly opened fire on Soviet territory. Finland immediately offered to investigate the incident jointly, but Moscow refused. Days later, the Soviet Union invades Finland and the Winter War begins. Stalin claims Finland attacked first. The shells were fired by the Red Army itself, a classic false flag designed to justify aggression and drag Finland into the global conflict. 1968. Czechoslovakia opens up, promises a freer socialism. Moscow sends in tanks. Brotherly help, they say, as they crush a generation's hope. 1994. Ukraine gives up its nuclear weapons for Russia's promise to respect its borders. 20 years later, those same borders burn. From the Winter War to the Prague Spring to today's Ukraine, the playbook stays the same. To live beside Russia is to live with history at your doorstep, and the knowledge that peace here is only ever temporary. I wanted to understand what happens when a former superpower feels small. When a single worldview shaped by the KGB and the Cold War decides the fate of millions. That's the story of modern Russia, and why no one around it can ever truly relax. Some people say that to truly understand Russia, you need to travel back over 1,000 years. Novgorod. Legend tells of a Viking leader named Rurik, who founded the dynasty here in the 800s, the one that would later shape Russia. History here is messy. What counts as truth depends on who's writing it. Leaders twist old events into tools of influence, using the past to justify the present. Most chronicles state that around 862 AD, Rurik was invited by the Slavic and Finnic tribes of Novgorod to rule and bring order. His successors moved south to Kiev, where Kievan Rus emerged as the first East Slavic state, a center of Orthodox faith and culture, whose founding story blends fact with legend. When the Mongols destroyed Kiev in the 1200s, power shifted north once again, this time to a small principality on the edge of empires, Moscow. For generations, the princes of Moscow ruled their small domain under the shadow of the Mongol Khans. They paid tribute, learned the system, and eventually copied parts of it, adopting their rulers' methods of control and expansion. What began as a minor principality on the frontier would, in time, claim to be the heir of Kievan Rus, the true successor of that lost kingdom. That myth became the heart of Russia's identity and its justification for empire. But something else happened. In 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, Moscow's rulers declared themselves the guardians of the last true faith, the Third Rome. Religion became politics, power became sacred duty. The idea of empire was now blessed by heaven itself. Under Ivan III, Moscow stopped paying tribute to the Mongols, absorbed rival principalities, and married into the old Byzantine line. He took the double-headed eagle as his emblem and called himself Tsar Caesar. It was the birth of Russian autocracy. One ruler, one faith, one destiny. While Europe was turning toward trade, cities, and parliaments, Russia turned inward. A fortress state learning to trust only itself. Isolation and control hardened into identity. From its earliest days, Russia expanded through force. Kievan Rus fought for control of river trade routes, but power came from collecting tolls and defending passage. Centuries later, Moscow followed the same pattern. Securing borders meant pushing them outward. In the 1500s, Ivan the Terrible conquered Kazan and Astrakhan, ending Tatar dominance and opening the Volga to Russian control. That victory marked the beginning of Russia's long eastward drive. Over the next 3 centuries, the Tsars built one of the largest empires on Earth, stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the Black Sea. Cossacks and soldiers claimed vast territories in Siberia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, while wars with Sweden, Poland, and the Ottoman Empire redrew the map of Europe. It was Peter the Great who opened Russia to the west, sent nobles abroad, built ships, and founded a new capital, St. Petersburg, a symbol of a nation forcing its way into the modern world. And he did it not just through reform, but through conquest, defeating Sweden, seizing Baltic lands, and carving Russia's place on the European map by force. Each expansion brought power, and with it, paranoia. The farther Russia expanded, the more it feared what lay beyond its new borders. By the 19th century, the empire had reached its greatest size, but remained haunted by the same anxiety that had shaped it from the start. This is the landscape you'll find across much of Russia. It's fair to say geography shaped Russia's historical psyche. West of the Urals lies a vast expanse of open plains, the East European Plain, stretching from the Baltic to the Urals, one of the world's largest flatlands. For most of its history, Russia has been exposed to invasion. From the Mongols to Napoleon to Hitler, the Russian heartland has been invaded again and again. Centuries of invasions and battles have made the feeling of threat part of Russia's national memory. That repeated trauma created a defensive mindset, survival through strength and control. In Russian strategic thinking, safety is achieved not by peace, but by pushing threats farther away. Tsars, commissars, presidents, different faces of the same instinct. Expand, protect, dominate. Losing territory felt like losing dignity. Endurance became a virtue. Wars, famine, repression, all turned into proof of national strength. To suffer was not failure, it was evidence of purity. This legacy helps explain why control is still seen as security and openness as risk. The result is a national psychology balanced between pride and paranoia, a country that sees itself as both hero and victim, defender and target. Each challenge from abroad feels like déjà vu, another chapter in a long siege. Generalizations about the national mindset are never perfect, but they still offer clues to why a country or a regime acts the way it does. When the empire finally collapsed, the reflex to dominate never disappeared. Today's Kremlin still follows the same story. Russia as an eternal great power, surrounded by enemies, forever fighting to survive. In modern Russia, the memory of World War II sits at the core of this national identity. It binds the country through a shared story of sacrifice and reinforces the belief that Russia has always been surrounded by enemies. The Soviet victory over Nazi Germany became the cornerstone of national pride. A sacred myth that still justifies almost any sacrifice in the name of security. Today, Russian foreign policy rests on deep-seated mistrust of the West and a pragmatic partnership with China and the global South. The leadership understands that military failure has historically preceded regime collapse, a lesson that reinforces its obsession with control. Every one of Russia's neighbors bears its own scars, from dealing with Moscow. They've lived through wars, occupations, and decades of control. Finland remembers the Winter War of 1939. When Stalin demanded territory for security, Finland refused. The Red Army invaded with 500,000 troops, expecting a quick victory. Instead, Finland fought back. They lost land, but kept their independence. The Baltic states remember mass deportations and occupation. When Soviet troops arrived in 1940, thousands of Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians were loaded into cattle cars and sent east to Siberia. Families vanished overnight. After the war, Moscow called it liberation. Poland remembers being erased from the map. In 1939, Stalin and Hitler secretly agreed to divide it. Soviet forces marched in from the east, Germans from the west. Both armies carried out brutal acts during the occupation of Poland, none darker than the Katyn massacre. On Joseph Stalin's orders, the Soviet secret police executed nearly 22,000 Polish officers, police, border guards, and intellectuals at Katyn Forest. A massacre Moscow denied for decades. The message was clear. Polish sovereignty ended where Russian security began. Ukraine remembers the famine of the 1930s, the Holodomor. Millions died as Stalin's regime seized grain to crush resistance. Entire villages starved while Soviet propaganda celebrated success. Georgia remembers 2008. When it turned westward and sought NATO membership, Russian troops crossed the border. Putin invaded Georgia. A 5-day war that left nearly 1,000 people dead and almost 200,000 displaced, as Moscow carved out South Ossetia and Abkhazia under the banner of peacekeeping, and still occupies them today. That's why when Russia speaks of security, its neighbors hear something else. They've heard it before, and they remember how it ends. So when they joined NATO, it wasn't aggression toward Russia.
Today we proudly welcome Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia.
It was escape from its gravity. What you're looking at is the end of an era. This bittersweet moment was captured in Moscow on Christmas Day, 1991. And suddenly, history feels lighter and emptier. Russia's present-day actions are shaped above all by one event: the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia fell into chaos. The state economy disintegrated, and a new class of oligarchs rose from the ashes of privatization. Some built empires through markets, others did it through the state. Corruption defined the entire transition. By the mid-1990s, pensions vanished, wages went unpaid, and life expectancy dropped. Democracy became a synonym for humiliation. Controlled corruption became Putin's formula for controlled stability. Power that once belonged to the Communist Party was now concentrated in one man. The security services that once formed the KGB simply re-emerged in many ways as the FSB. Many of Russia's new elite, including Putin himself, came from those same ranks, shaped by the same worldview. The courts remain political. A discreet phone call, a practice known as telefono e pravo or telephone justice, can still decide how a case ends. It began in the Soviet era when party officials directed verdicts through personal contacts instead of written orders. It survived every reform and still defines how power operates today. The media, once propaganda for the party, now serves the presidency. Television and newspapers repeat the same narrative. Russia is surrounded by enemies, and only unity under strong leadership can save it. The state still controls what matters: oil, gas, weapons, television. Oligarchs keep their fortunes only as long as they serve the Kremlin. Surveillance went digital. Censorship online. Russia's opposition today exists in exile, in prison, or under constant threat. Many in the West believed that the fall of the Soviet Union would naturally lead Russia toward liberal democracy and integration with Europe. In reality, the collapse created not a new democracy, but a power vacuum, quickly filled by corruption, nostalgia, and the old habits of control. As I dug deeper into the Kremlin's ideology, one name kept popping up.
Modernity against the tradition. Confrontation between sea power and land power. Land power represented by Russia, by heartland. Sea power represented by modern globalist, postmodern, liberal West.
This is Alexander Dugin, the philosopher known as Putin's Rasputin. His ideas mix mysticism, geopolitics, and empire, and his name keeps surfacing everywhere in Russia's public life. Dugin isn't the Kremlin's only ideologue, but he's certainly one of the most important and intriguing. Depending on who you ask, he's either the grand strategist behind Russia's imperial comeback, or just a loud ideologue riding the wave. Dugin's worldview splits humanity in two. On one side, the Atlantic world, the United States, NATO, liberal democracy, individualism. On the other, Eurasia, land powers rooted in tradition, hierarchy, and spiritual identity, with Russia at its center. In his book Foundations of Geopolitics, Dugin lays out a plan: rebuild a Eurasian empire, push the US out of Europe, divide the West, and bring the post-Soviet world back under Moscow's influence. He calls it a civilizational mission. Later in his fourth political theory, he argues for a new ideology built on tradition, collective destiny, and Russia's spiritual uniqueness. This idea deeply resonated with people who felt the 1990s as loss and humiliation. Before the Russo-Georgian War in 2008, Dugin predicted that Russia would eventually attack Georgia, and later Ukraine and Crimea, which he described as historically part of Russia anyway. Although some argue that Dugin's influence is overstated, his name keeps resurfacing whenever you dig into the Kremlin's ideology. Putin may not quote Dugin directly, but he speaks the same language. Multipolar world, civilizational struggle, spiritual sovereignty. Dugin didn't design the Kremlin's playbook. He just gave it words and a map. Parts of that map, from Georgia to Ukraine, are being redrawn right now. For Russia, all history leads back to Kiev. In July 2021, Vladimir Putin published an essay called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. It uses the language of history to sell a political narrative. Putin argues that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are one people, divided only by foreign plots and Soviet mistakes. He traces both peoples back to Kievan Rus, claiming that Ukraine was largely created by Russian and Soviet power. To him, Ukraine's post-1991 independence and its 2014 revolution were Western manipulations designed to sever a natural bond. The essay rewrites centuries of history to justify control, claiming Ukraine belongs to Russia's spiritual and political world. It became required reading for the Russian military, a story that turns invasion into reunification. Historians see this as imperial mythology. Ukraine's cultural and political identity long predates Soviet borders. Its western regions developed under European institutions, Polish, Lithuanian, and later Austro-Hungarian, traditions that encouraged civic autonomy rather than subservience. as former Soviet states rushed to join NATO for protection, Poland, Hungary, the Baltics, and later Finland and Sweden, the West saw security, but Moscow saw a tightening ring of enemies. For Putin, the world since 1991 is an unfinished story. A humiliation to be corrected, not a past to be accepted. In today's world, Russia has turned hybrid warfare into an art form. Combine secret forces, local proxies, and a media script, and you can annex territory while insisting you had nothing to do with it. Deny, distract, then deliver the outcome. Make it messy enough to keep everyone guessing. Keep plausible deniability on the table so the political cost is muted. And most important, make the consequence permanent. Hybrid warfare is a long game built around influence and perception. Russia is a master at finding cracks inside other countries, political rifts, protests, egos, and turning them into weapons. Diplomats, journalists, politicians, anyone standing in Moscow's way can face pressure. Cyber attacks, propaganda, intimidation, all designed to fracture trust inside open societies. It's not about winning arguments, it's about drowning reality in noise. Mix 60% truth with 40% fiction, enough to sound credible, enough to destroy belief in anything. It's not meant to make you believe Moscow, it's meant to make you stop believing anyone. It's tempting to think that Russia's behavior comes down to one man, that if Vladimir Putin disappeared tomorrow, things would return to normal. But that's a dangerous illusion. The ideas behind Putin's worldview are far older than he is. It's said that Putin takes his cues from three figures: Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great, all rulers who built Russia through conquest. For centuries, Russian rulers have believed their country is entitled to dominate its neighbors, that control means safety and obedience means peace. That mindset survived revolutions, wars, and even the fall of the Soviet Union. But the hardest part of talking about Russia isn't the past, it's the future. After Ukraine, Russia stands at a crossroads. As I dug into what Russia's future might look like, I stumbled on something interesting. In his Russia Tomorrow series, Casey Mitchell sketches 5 paths for Russia's future, from endless dictatorship to outright disintegration. In the first scenario, Putin endures. The current system survives with minimal change. The war continues at a manageable cost. Repression deepens and society adapts to long-term isolation. Putin's regime stabilizes through fear, control, and the promise of order. A frozen conflict becomes the new normal. In another, nationalists take over. After Putin, more radical factions consolidate power. Hardliners push for a more aggressive, ideological state built on militarism and anti-Western sentiment. Foreign policy grows unpredictable, but domestic control remains tight, with fewer restraints and louder rhetoric. There's also the possibility of a technocratic reset. Power shifts to a pragmatic leadership that keeps the old system but changes its tone. Corruption and centralized control persist, but the regime presents itself as modern, efficient, and open to limited reforms. This scenario offers stability without real transformation, continuity under a new brand. Or a more unlikely path, a democratic turn. A genuine internal shift begins after elite fragmentation or public unrest. Reformists gain influence, leading to decentralization, political pluralism, and attempts to confront the legacy of empire. The transition would be uneven and fragile, but it would mark Russia's first real move toward accountable governance. And finally, the most chaotic outcome: fracture. The state loses coherence as regions assert autonomy and central authority weakens. Economic collapse or military defeat accelerates disintegration, producing instability and local power struggles. The outcome is uncertain, ranging from new independent republics to prolonged internal conflict across the former federation. History turns quickly. The point is not to guess which Russia emerges, but to prepare for every one of them. Because while Russia decides what it wants to become, its neighbors already have, free and staying that way.